healthy journey into theological understanding will be marked by the way it impacts not only our thinking, but also our action in the world. But it's equally true that our everyday engagement with the kingdom of God in real and practical ways can then launch us further into our theological inquiry and understanding. In this episode, I talk with Nigel Langford, whose journey towards adoption with his wife Nicky has led him into a deeper and richer grasp of theologies of waiting, suffering, and fulfillment, and ultimately, of the goodness of the gospel. Welcome to Theodisc. I'm your host, Kenny Innes, and I'd love if you would subscribe to the podcast and share episodes with your friends and family. We want to see people from all walks of life engaging in deep, yet accessible theology for the growth of their faith and the building up of the whole body of Christ. Nigel Langford is a director of domestic mission for Bible Society and has a long history in church planting and leadership. He's also the chair of trustees for WTC, has achieved his graduate diploma, and is now nearing the end of his MA. In this conversation, Nigel was deeply honest about the amazing journey God has led his family on, and I do hope it will speak hope and encouragement to you as you listen. All right, Nigel Langford, delighted to have you on the Theodisc podcast.
Thank you, Kenny. How are you?
I'm doing all right. We're having this conversation fairly early in our workday.
We are.
I look like I've already reached the end of the workday, but you are looking pretty dapper this morning.
Well, sometimes you just have to, don't you? Often I freeze my screen out because I wish I could freeze just around to my head because I don't always come out looking particularly dapper according to my family members. So.
Well, this is going to be a really interesting conversation today because we're going to be talking about adoption and theological understanding of that. What's interesting is that you actually have some experience. Quite often we talk about how our theology leads us into acting in the world.
Yeah.
You perhaps have come from this where your action or things that God has been doing in you has led you into a deeper theological understanding.
Yeah.
So we'll get to that in just a minute. Before we do that, your first time guest. So you must answer the 3 questions that every first time guest must go through when they come onto Theodisc. So this is just for our listeners to get to know you just a little bit.
Yeah.
We want to talk about things that are constants in your life, things that you return to.
Yeah.
3 categories are a book, a food, and a location or a place.
Right.
So let's go with the first one. What's a book that you return to?
Probably The Epic of Eden by Sandra Richter. I read that book and it totally transformed how I read the Old Testament and how I viewed it. And so I go back to it regularly because she talks a lot about something that's not in place in my life, a tidy cupboard with things hanging neatly on, on different things in there. And she sort of coat hangers.
Yep.
And I just loved how she sort of built a context for how to understand the scriptures and work through the Old Testament especially.
Yeah.
So I go back to that a lot.
Yeah, taking all those disconnected stories or the way we sometimes think and organizing them in a way that we can understand.
Yes.
Standard reading.
Yes.
For anybody who studies at WTC, but an excellent book that anyone should pick up.
Very good. Yes, excellent book.
What about a food or a meal that you return to?
Well, I'm pretty predictable when it comes to desserts. So I thought, you talked about a constant. Probably sticky toffee pudding is definitely a constant for me.
Sticky toffee pudding, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you go with the ice cream, a little bit of custard? What do you?
Oh, okay. So I go with cream and ice cream. Just like if you're gonna hit 1,000 calories, do it in style. Is my sort of viewpoint.
I love it. That's great. I want to eat sticky toffee pudding with you sometime. Okay. And finally, a location or a place that you return to.
So, definitely for me, my heritage is Wales and going down to the Gower coast, the Gower coastline, just past Swansea, on the way up to further west, up to St. David's. It's just a beautiful part of the world. And going for walks along Langland Bay and Caswell Bay, Yeah. Hopefully when there's not a massive storm and it's raining, but when the sun shows up occasionally, it's just it takes me back to my childhood. I've
Yeah.
got really happy memories there.
Brilliant. Thank you,
Mm.
Nigel. Now we know you at
There you go.
least just a wee bit. I mean, someone like sticky toffee pudding, they're all right with me. And Welsh, all that's good. Okay, so let's kind of turn to what we want to talk about today. So we're really coming out of, as we said earlier, your family's experience. You maybe want to just give us a little bit of background about
Mm.
how adoption has become a part
Mm.
of your family.
Yeah, yeah. So, without like jumping too far into the story, at the beginning, um, adoption became eventually the only sort of viable route for us to start a family in, and it wasn't how we had originally imagined it. But I'll come on to that later. And we just went through a process of quite a grueling process of
Mm-hmm.
working with a certain social worker and having your life turned upside down, and so that was really interesting.
Yeah.
But the process led to us adopting a beautiful little boy 2 days before the first lockdown in March 2020. We had to literally put him in the back of our car and drive up to London just before Boris Johnson declared the first lockdown. And that's how we got to know him.
Wow.
23 hours a day in the house.
Wow.
So it was interesting.
So obviously that had been, and we'll get further into the story as we go through our conversation.
Mm.
But obviously that was a point after a long wait and a long journey that you guys had been on.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things that I often find interesting to process is how much of an instant world we live in. We want to put something in the microwave, and how long is it going to take? That's the first thing you look at on the back, isn't it? Take 6 minutes. That's crazy. If we go into a hotel or a coffee shop and we're not connected to the Wi-Fi in, 15, 20 seconds, we're up in arms. And we don't realize how much of an instant world we live in.
Yep.
And quite often God works at his own pace. There's a different story that's working, and sometimes in our culture the two can jar together. But it all began, I think, sort of early on when my wife came down one morning to breakfast and said, "Nige, I've had a dream about a blonde boy." And I wasn't quite sure where this was going initially, because I thought, "You've had a dream? I thought I was your only blonde boy. I mean, what is going on here?" So I was looking over I thought, is this confession time? What's actually happening here? And she said, "No, don't be silly." She said, I had a dream about a little blonde boy. He was sitting on my lap and he was laughing. And I can not ever forget the sensation of the love I felt and how complete I felt. And so we kind of took that as it's time to start a family. And we embarked on 11 to 12 years of infertility. So, every month for 11 years, at a certain point, your highs and your lows, you go through it all. And sometimes the worst place to be infertile is the church, because, everybody's naming it and claiming it and, saying it and bringing it forth and casting it out. And everybody means well, but often there's human beings on the other side of it who are just wrestling with what's going on when your friends are on their second and third child and you haven't managed to even enable your first one to appear. So we went through an 11, 12-year stretch of infertility. And then just when we'd kind of given up all hope, really, Nicky fell pregnant. And we have a lot of banter in our relationship. So when she first told me, I didn't know whether it was just a really, really dark joke on a Saturday morning, over breakfast. I said, "Oh." But I realized that she was actually serious. And, we sort of entered this period of jubilation only to have to really deal with some serious serious pain when our son didn't make it to the end of the pregnancy and died. And that happened on our wedding anniversary. So we kind of felt completely and utterly lost. Why would we fall pregnant for this to happen? And why would that happen on our wedding anniversary? I think it plunged us into like a really challenging place that we didn't feel prepared for. I think, what we'll come on to later is there was a sense of just feeling that we weren't prepared to walk through these things. We were always looking to victory and to breakthrough. And, in sort of Pentecostal and charismatic circles, the ones that we grew up in, it was always, you fix your eyes on that. You don't fix your eyes on the problem. And quite often what that does, it just leads you into a place of denial, where something's just building inside of you that's not particularly healthy. So we found ourselves at that moment in a really difficult place. And we were like associate pastors at a large church at that point. And I remember going to my church leader, and asking him not to preach, anymore, because I didn't know whether I believed what I was actually saying. And they were very gracious. Their response was, well, the fact you feel like that probably gives you the platform to speak with integrity into other people's lives. So yeah, that sums up sort of in a couple of minutes an awful lot of activity, but it was a super challenge for us, really.
I mean, obviously, we've already alluded to this idea that in charismatic evangelical circles, we're constantly talking about the power of God and God's ability to intervene.
Yes.
With your experience in that and that long waiting time, and then to have tragedy and disappointment, how did you wrestle with what seemed to be the incongruity between those two?
It was really hard. It was really difficult. I mean, there were many times when we just felt we couldn't even talk about it. And, being the man of faith, you have these identities, don't you, wrapped up in ego, quite often in church. You're the man of faith. You're the man with the answer for everyone else. My wife, you're the woman of prophetic this and leading this. And we find ourselves both kind of like in that moment where, we don't have any answers. And so we went through a real long time of waiting before we went into adoption, because we just felt we couldn't do it with integrity. We were reacting from a place of pain, and that's just where we were. And so we actually spent an awful lot of time, which was hard for me as an extrovert, walking, being by ourselves and reflecting and really challenging each other, because, let's be honest about it, our marriage really struggled through this period. And so we just went down to the depths. I can remember just feeling like there's nothing left. And it was this constant everyday challenge of, when I say submitting to Christ, it really wasn't that spectacular or holy. It was literally sometimes just a confession. Like, Lord, I don't know where you are. I really don't know where you are, but I trust you. And so I know we may talk about sort of like this whole theology of suffering more deeply shortly, but I think sort of in that waiting period before adoption, I found myself, even on my own as an extrovert, which was really weird, walking up and down sort of where my wife's parents live in Southend along the seafront. And one day just heard this voice come back, because the heavens were really quiet up to that moment. And I remember just wrestling with adoption, and I said to the Lord, I don't want somebody else's child, which I suddenly realized when I came on, how callous it sounded and how selfish it sounded. But that's where we were at. And I said, I don't want to adopt. And then I heard the Holy Spirit say to me, but you're adopted. And I was like, how cheeky. My birth parents live in Wales. Thank you very much. I'm not adopted. And then I heard this voice where I said, but I adopted you. And I froze. I literally froze on the spot and felt something within me just sort of shift. And it wasn't like massively quick or anything, but I felt like my heart was warm towards the adoption process, and then we embarked on that. But I think it just really, not to say forced is the wrong word, but it sort of created a space in my life where before that, everything seemed to go really well, and everything was looking the way it should look. But I tell you that, there was a period of time and then a couple of scriptures that spoke to me, and it really helped form this, not just a theology of waiting, but an understanding and a theology of suffering, because I was never given a template to walk through. Because if I had suffering in my life, I was cursed, right? If I was suffering, there was something seriously wrong on my side.
Right.
But this whole experience kind of like took that apart. Like Holy Week for me suddenly became just a massive revelation of like two high points of Palm Sunday and Resurrection Sunday. And then in the middle, complete carnage. Like, the disciples feel abandoned. Jesus is off somewhere. Jesus is betrayed. Everybody scatters. Jesus is tortured, murdered, complete silence of Saturday. Everybody's all over the shop before the Sunday. And I think quite often, what I've grown up with is, let's get from Palm Sunday to Resurrection Sunday super quick and go la, la, la as we run through the middle of it and pretend it's not there. And I don't think the scriptures have ever encouraged us to walk through life like that. And I don't think it helps others. And the two Psalms that really helped me connect with God in those dark moments was Psalm 56, verse 8, which says, "You have captured my tears in your bottle and recorded every one of them in your book." And I just remember feeling like, what, every single tear? And there's been many that have flowed down my face. You've captured it. It matters to you. You remember. You remember my pain. You remember my story. And then Psalm 34:8, which says, "God is near to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit." And I just remember thinking, do you know what? Maybe victory isn't always standing on the top of the mountain, going raw, Maybe victory is experiencing the embrace of Jesus when you least expected it.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that whole process of losing a child and then heading toward adoption really helped me to see that.
Yeah. I think even about, that it's funny that as our faith has embedded into it this idea of waiting and of suffering.
Yeah.
And in our particular corner of the Christian world, maybe it's partly a cultural thing, Nigel, that you spoke about earlier, the culture that we exist in. But there is also the sense of, if God is for us, who can be against us, which becomes nothing ever challenging or difficult will happen.
Yeah.
But I think about that even at the birth of Jesus, which is the fulfillment of all of Israel's long waiting and the promises that have been given, even then there's still a wait, because he doesn't come out of the womb and just start acting. There's still a wait until that promise matures. And then when he does come to the age of where he starts his ministry, that ministry is marked by suffering.
And you're right, Kenny, right? It's like 33 years on the planet, 3 years of really active ministry. And in the Advent phase of it's meant to be a time that we celebrate waiting and the power of waiting. But we don't always see that valued sometimes. Maybe, I've been massively enriched in my role at Bible Society and working with the Orthodox and Catholic traditions who put so much value on reflection and waiting. It really ministered to me quite a lot. But yes, I think you're right. I think, I read a book a while back, or was recommended a book, and I don't know if you read like this as a student. I hope no lecturers are listening to this. But so you skim read a book, sort of like, and you're mining for the gold, aren't you? And that's the best way of putting it. And I think it was something called "God is Not in a Rush." And I can't remember who wrote it. I'll have to go and Google it. But I remember just reading little segments of it, and it really resonated with me that my vision of what God wanted for me needed to happen in this time frame, and it needed to look like this. But actually, he was doing something different. And I got loads of questions. I have so many questions. I have more questions than answers. But I think what I've come to the realization of is God's story and my story are not separated. And that in the middle of the difficulty of it all, he's actually there. He's incarnate. He's there with me, surrounding me and helping me, even when I can't see him.
Yeah.
It's like the book of Ruth, all that tragedy and pain. God's not even mentioned really by name in appearing anywhere or anything like that. And yet there is a prevailing of what God wants. And God's not mentioned in the book of Esther, and you see the same kind of thing happening.
Yep.
God is often his hiddenness is not his absence.
Yeah. That's brilliant.
And I think that's what it's brought to my life.
So you guys had this deep desire to have a child.
Yes.
Your wife has had this dream, which feels like a promise from God of a blonde boy.
Yeah.
You go through this incredibly difficult and long period of waiting and suffering. And yet you also receive, in your kind of crying out to God, you receive this this word from God about the power of adoption and how that's also part of your identity as his child.
Yeah.
So it feels like during that period, which may have not been easy to see at the time, but it feels like maybe your expectations, God was doing something with your expectations in that.
Yeah, there definitely is something quite remarkable. I talk about it as reimagined family. Like, it wasn't what I had imagined it to be, but there was a reimagination in that. It wasn't just that I feel like this was God's best for us. But you ask my wife and I now, we would not change it for the world. We have this incredible, beautiful little boy who's radically changed our world. I mean, the sort of thing with adoption is we think we're rescuing the child, but actually the child is bringing something to us that we could never possibly imagine they would bring. And so, yes, the expectation shifted. I think God earthed my faith and put deep roots into it, and suddenly found that wherever Nicky and I went, we were praying for literally tens of hundreds of people just in the last few years, obviously with COVID with an exception. But just praying for people who are not just infertile or going through adoption, but just this whole thing about like waiting and suffering. But that is not the absence of God. It's sort of like it's God meeting you in that place unexpectedly and working you forward. And something quite deep started to form in me about why have we lost the narrative of adoption? Or I feel like I've not heard it taught a lot when it comes to the gospel. For me, I grew up and I was asked, do you want to give your life to Jesus? Yes. Say this prayer after me. So I said a prayer and then I was in. So I joined a membership club, and then I was just told, you got to behave because Jesus is coming next week. Look busy. It's kind of like that sort of, it was this real fear aspect. It was like a really sort of, I call it a delusional eschatology, but, I don't want to offend too many people, and I can hear my grandfather and, rolling around somewhere in Wales at the moment thinking, I can't believe my grandson's there now. But I from creation right through, I suddenly saw that there was this God through creation who extended his table of hospitality to mankind. And actually it was like an invitation to come, right? And so he creates this temple and he creates his table, and it's to be in communion. It's to be in fellowship with. And so when that disconnection of fellowship and relationship happens, there's this complete brokenness. You can feel it in God's heart, this desire for that covenant and that redemption to bring it back, to buy it back, to make things right. And I just found myself reading the scriptures through this lens of the father and his children.
Yeah.
And I started to think, well, why don't we talk about the gospel as adoption? Let me give you an example, if I can, Kenny, like a really practical one. Let's take adoption, the sort of way it happens. You search for the child. You rescue the child, in some ways is what the terminology is. You take the child. You bring them into your house and they spend time with you, right? And all the pain, all the mess, all the trauma, all the triggers. That child is not going to be put outside the house. It's not going to be kicked out. It spends time and suddenly realizes it's a safe place. Then over time, you start to see little mannerisms coming. They're sort of catching some of you, and suddenly there's this transaction between you and the child of all the quirks you develop from your parents. But spending time in our presence, there's that sense of, even though we are fallen human beings, we are bringing some grace and some healing, and obviously the presence of God in our house. And then one day the judge calls us up and he says, right, Dominic is now Dominic Andrew Roy Langford, and he now bears your name. And as a result of him bearing your name, he now has all rights to your whole estate. Are you happy with that? And I remember just getting to the end of that and thinking, what has he done to get any of this stuff? Like, what has he done? He hasn't done anything. I mean, this is really good news for him.
Yeah.
Right. He, and then I think Jesus, even in all the parables, he sought after the one. He found the one, brought them back. We're brought into God's family. We're brought into his house. We spend time in his presence. We heal up. We realize the beauty of God. And then we commit ourselves and we give ourselves to him, and we end up bearing his name. We become heirs. We're raised with Christ, and we have done nothing. We have done absolutely nothing to be in that position. And I think in a world that is fearful and lost and broken and isolated, staring at all these crises everywhere, we have a message of extravagant grace that's at the heart of the gospel. And I think if we stopped trying to work out who's in or who's out for whatever reason, but actually have that posture of what adoption requires. I'll tell you what it required of me: servanthood, humility, listening, suffering together, rejoicing together, receiving a new identity, knowing who we are. It's that kind of thing of like, it's a really, really sacrificial posture, but I believe it's one that's at the heart of the gospel.
Mm. Yeah, and in that you enter into that experience of the Father's desire for his children and what he goes through to bring them home.
Yeah, and I, just to throw in a little thing here, I often think we talk a lot about the incarnate Christ and the crucified Christ, the resurrected Christ, but sometimes I think we neglect the ascended Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's the time when we're raised. It's like, to know who we are in Christ is a remarkable, extravagant interaction. And I just think, wow, that is amazing. And I suppose it's the whole adoption that's really fed my theology, and it keeps feeding it now. Mm-hmm. Even the crisis of discipleship, I think real discipleship is that understanding of who we are, our identity, what God has done for us. And therefore our posture to the world shifts and is influenced as a result. And I think that's how the kingdom comes in all its fullness. I'm not saying that adoption is the only image of the gospel. There's many images of the gospel that we can look to, but I feel like we've lost that image of adoption. Yeah. And I really feel like I'm called to really make that visible to the people I connect.
I was just going to say that, whether you've considered that, families like yours and others who have gone on the adoption journey, it's not just like an illustration of the gospel, it's an enactment of the gospel.
Yes, it really is, because the reason why we're talking to loads of people at the moment who just don't know Jesus. We tell them the story of our son, and then I just throw in like a massive cannonball at the end, and that's why I have a faith, because my faith is completely mirrored by that. And by the end of it, I can't remember the last time somebody went, "What a load of rubbish." Literally, people are like, "Yeah, I didn't know that was what Christianity was about. Yeah. Why hasn't anyone told me?" Yeah. So it's embodied, and that's what gives it the authenticity.
So maybe part of church is reclaiming adoption as kind of a way of explaining the gospel is not just in the way that we articulate the gospel story, but maybe part of it as well is actually encouraging, walking alongside families who are enacting this gospel truth in their lives.
Absolutely. And even like valuing and naming the values that it takes to see adoption of children, of teenagers, whoever. I read Philippians too, and I often think, wow, when Paul's writing about the leadership of Jesus, and you think, yeah, that kind of posture is what it needs, and yeah, however you can help those who are doing it, but also to value and put a priority on the sort of kingdom values that it takes to live in a community like that. Is really powerful.
Well, we're just gonna have to wrap up here, but just as a kind of a final question to throw out to you, and really maybe not so much a question for you, but as an encouragement for you to share, what would you say to people who are listening to this, and whether it's in the context of how they're looking to form their families or something else? What would you say to people who are in their own periods of waiting, of suffering, of the unexpected fulfillment?
Yeah. Well, the advice I'm given is through like a myriad of mistakes. So I'd say don't give up. Don't give up. Hold on. Connect with people who are for you, right? I mean, that was difficult for us. There were times we connected with the wrong people and ended up on the end of feeling quite battered at times because, I think you do have to be discerning about who you give your heart to, especially when your heart's broken. So hold on, don't give up. Reach out to Jesus. Just don't give up on him. He won't give up on you, but find people that you can eat with, cry with, pray with, who love you. Things won't make sense. Just be at peace with that. You may have more questions than answers until you see Jesus. I kind of think that's part of the deal.
Right.
And be kind to yourself. Oh gosh. I mean, because of some of that thinking and theology I grew up with, I spent a couple of years trying to work out what I'd done, what I'd done wrong. And I just don't think that was helpful at all, or right, or biblical.
Yep.
So be kind to yourself. And I suppose the two last things I'd say that I did, which are a bit more practical, is I ate chocolate and watched The West Wing. The West Wing's my favorite series of all time. And even though it looks dated now compared to other things, I still watch it. Yeah. I still love the way Jed Butler puts his jacket on, and I love chocolate. And I literally spent hours walking as well to balance up the sticky toffee pudding at the beginning. But, you've got to do things that not just spirit and emotional, but those sort of really practical things that feed your soul as well. And they're pretty much in a nutshell, those are the kind of things that Nicky and I did. And dependent on what week you spoke to us, we felt we were some weeks okay. Yeah, okay, we're getting there. And other weeks when we just didn't know where we were. But from this angle right now, where we are today, I just look back and I think those are the things that sustained us and helped us. And so please, if any of those things help you, put them in your lives.
Nigel, thank you so much for sharing your Nicky's story and just being willing to talk through how God's spoken to you through it. And I think, interestingly, sometimes when we have conversations like this is not a conversation of conclusion. In fact, the story is still being written and your family is still being formed and all those things. I think that's the amazing part.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point you brought out, because what I'm not talking about now is all the tension and difficulty we're going through now.
Yeah.
And all the trauma we're dealing with and all the pain we're dealing with now. So you're absolutely right. The story continues. But I have this sense of hope because I've read the book and it all ends well.
Yeah.
But between now and then, the story continues.
Yeah. Blessings, Nigel. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, Nigel and Kenny, for that inspiring story, highlighting how adoption is something every Christian is actually familiar with, and how it theologically ties into periods of hardship and suffering, but also of joy and rejoicing in our Christian walk. In our next episode, Kenny will be joined by Alan Emerson and Roger Ellis, who teach the module Shapes of the Church, Past, Present and Future on the Church Planting and Leadership Graduate Diploma at WTC. Alan and Roger speak from a wealth of church planting knowledge and experience, and this episode is a must-listen for anyone interested in the subject. Thank you for listening to episode 28 of Theodisc. Join us for episode 29 with Alan and Roger as we discuss all things to do with church planting. Bye for now.